Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to take another look at Lewis and Clark and whether there are some enduring lessons from that famous journey across the Great Plains and into the Pacific Northwest. My guest today is Dr. Brett Mizelle. Dr. Mizelle is a professor of history and he is also the director of the American Studies program. Welcome, Brett, and thank you for coming back for your second visit to Talking Points.
It's great to be here.
Well, in addition to being our guest today, we're also going to ask you to be our trailblazing guide through the American frontier today. So we'll start with the Louisiana Purchase because that was obviously what happened prior to the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery expedition. So when Thomas Jefferson, our third president, bought the Louisiana Territory from France, from Napoleon in fact, we didn't know a lot about the territory. What in fact did we know about that Louisiana Territory at that time?
Yeah, astonishingly little in hindsight. We knew a little bit more about the southern borderlands because of the history of the Spanish there, and Alexander von Humboldt was there exploring at the period of time, and there was a little bit we knew about the Pacific coast thanks to the British, but there was not much information at all other than information acquired by fur traders, both French fur traders and some Anglo fur traders. There was a really famous duo, a Scotsman and a Welsh explorer, who had done one of the earliest maps of the Missouri River. So there were some ideas of what might be there and how you might go west, but for the most part, very little. It really was terra incognita.
Mm-hmm. And before we talk about the fur traders and the fur trappers and that sort of thing, first let's talk about a concept that later came into our vocabulary, and that was manifest destiny, which involved the expansion of the American West. Was Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery expedition, was that a necessary precursor to the later expansion and the so-called manifest destiny? Or do we need to look at Lewis and Clark on its own merits, that expedition? It had, obviously it's related if you look at it in hindsight, but was there any idea at that time that there would be a manifest destiny, if you will, to follow?
No, not really. I think it's really great to think of them as kind of separate phenomena. I mean, this is so early in the early republic, and so Americans are still trying to deal with the legacies of the Revolution. We're talking about, an expedition that took place from 1804 to 1806 that's authorized in 1803. We're so close to kind of the original moment of the new republic. People are still trying to understand and settle the Ohio River Valley. So it didn't really quite happen that there was a direct connection then towards the ideas of manifest destiny, which were coined by John O'Sullivan in 1845. It does set up that sense that we do have a right or a history in this kind of territory, but I think it's always more useful to consider the early exploration period separate from what really happens after the War of 1812. I always say that the War of 1812 and its aftermath really enables the United States to expand and have a different vision of itself than it had before the War of 1812 when it was still a fragile early republic.
And as you said a moment ago, there were the French fur traders and fur trappers that were traveling through this region prior to the arrival of Lewis and Clark, and there were some mountain men who decided to live amongst and in the plains and the mountains and so forth. But as far as the first journey to actually officially document and map and chart along the way, this was the first, and there were some surprises, of course, that Lewis and Clark encountered. What were some of the biggest surprises that they ran into?
Yeah, probably the biggest one was the colossal disappointment of the entire expedition, that there was no easy way to get from basically St. Louis to the Pacific coast, that there was no river connection across the Rocky Mountains. The Rocky Mountains, I think, were frankly a terrible surprise. They thought there would be a much easier way to get across the continent, and that was one of Jefferson's main goals, find an easy way to get across the continent. I think the other big surprises, there were several. One was the sophistication really of Native American culture out in the West. One of the villages they stayed in when they got to the Mandan and Hidatsa villages. These are communities with 4,000 or 5,000 inhabitants, multiple tribes. In essence, I think they were stunned to see basically a city that was as big, frankly, as some cities of the early American Republic, way, way out on the far western frontier of what was the, not even then the United States.
When we talk about the fact that there was no waterway all the way to the Pacific coast, big disappointment, but also it could have been very tragic because we know what happened 40-some years later with the Donner Party that ran into a terrible situation in the Sierra Nevadas. So what kept this journey, the Corps Discovery Expedition, from running into the same tragedy that the Donner Party did?
It certainly helped that they were a military expedition. So because they were in essence chartered and authorized by the government, and these were commissioned soldiers, there was a sense of discipline, right? There was a sense of order. There was a real powerful sense of mission. I think everyone involved in the mission, even the men we know less about than, for example, Lewis and Clark and the major lieutenants and sergeants, really were committed to kind of following through on the mission, and that helped. And of course, then the major factor, I think, in their kind of success, unlike the Donner Party later, was the assistance of Native peoples. I mean, they could not have done this without bartering and trading with the locals for information, for food, for supplies, materials, horses, boats, all kinds of things.
And really the most amazing fact about the Lewis and Clark journey to me, when I studied it more and more, was the fact that they only lost one man on the journey of the original Discovery team. And out of about roughly 40 men, only one was lost who died along the way. And that was because he had basically peritonitis, which is a burst appendix. So there was nothing they could have done about that. He probably would have died even if he hadn't been on the journey from that same condition. Right. And so they were very lucky in that regard. They managed to get through all of their encounters with the Native Americans without losing anyone. There were some tense moments, of course, but they were able to get along. They were able to negotiate effectively with the Native Americans, and in fact, as you mentioned, they even lived with them in a village for the first winter. So there was another aspect of this that we should also talk about, and that is William Clark brought along his black slave with him, a man by the name of York, and he was quite a fascination by the Native Americans. Maybe talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, I think the big part for the first sector of your question is that just they were really lucky a lot. I mean, just the idea that no one like broke a leg, no one got seriously injured, even with an accident on the way across, is pretty remarkable. And then yes, I think the nature of the people they brought was really interesting. I mean, Lewis was obviously very educated, had done the background work in science and languages. And then they had people like York, who served in essence as kind of a cultural broker. He was someone of great interest. Most native peoples on the Western Plains and beyond had never seen an African American before. So they were very interested in these types of things. And then, of course, Sacagawea, who was with them, also became kind of a factor that enabled them to seem more peaceful, less like a military party, and a little more kind of human and relatable, I think, than they would have been had it simply been a straight military mission.
And you talked about Sacagawea. We refer to her usually as Sacagawea, which is not the right way to say it, but nonetheless, she was a 16-year-old bride of a French fur trader. She also had a baby that she had to carry with her and care for along the way. Have we given her enough credit for this journey? And if she hadn't been along, is it very possible that things could have fallen apart?
Yeah, I think in some ways, and this will sound like a terrible thing to say, I think we've probably given her a bit too much credit. I know we want to humanize the mission and talk about its diversity in that kind of sense, but she wasn't as much of a guide, I think, as much of the popular literature talks about. I think her main kind of role, and not to underestimate that role, an important role, is again as a translator, right? She could do the translation and the interpretation. Also, the very presence of a woman, a young woman, with a baby, really made the mission seem less like a war party, right? It seemed less like a military mission designed to conquer the West. So I think it helped in that kind of sense, but a lot of the popular literature makes it sound like she saved kind of the expedition. And I'm not sure it's that strong, but it's really useful that she was there. One indication of the way they thought about her is when you read the actual journals, and I always encourage students and the public to read the Gary Moulton one-volume edition of the journals. And it's kind of surprising how much Meriwether Lewis kind of badmouths her kind of throughout kind of the journey and found her kind of a bit in the way. Clark, on the other hand, really liked her and called her Janie, gave her a nickname, and kind of had this really kind of more affectionate relationship with her. So I think she certainly helped, and is certainly important to the modern iconography of the mission there.
Well, what's interesting in what you just said about the different perceptions of Sacagawea by Clark and Lewis kind of shows the whole human side of this mission. We're talking about human beings ultimately. Yes, it's a military type of mission with folks that are adventurers. These are tough men for the most part, and they're going along and running into these different cultures. The dynamics of those cultures must have been very interesting in terms of the intercultural interaction that we're talking about here. But it seems to me that Lewis and Clark went into this vast territory. They had weapons, they did have some guns, and they were able to use those guns to trade in some cases. But they weren't an overwhelming force. They were clearly going to be outnumbered by any Native Americans that they happened to run into. So they had to use negotiating skills that are different from what we might see today. They didn't come in with superior numbers. They couldn't rely on force or coercion to negotiate. Are there any enduring lessons from that for us today?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, their mission was, in essence, to not really subjugate, but at least to declare American dominion over these kind of territories. And they did that with exchange of gifts. They had these really famous medals with a picture of Jefferson on one side to try to establish, in essence, diplomatic relationships there. But I think what you said is exactly right. They didn't have any overwhelming force. They had to go into the West with a sense of humility, with a sense that they really were dependent upon the people they were going to encounter. And I think one of the important lessons I always draw from the Lewis and Clark expedition was that sense of humility. I mean, they came in with really strong ethnocentric ideas about savagery, right, or the primitiveness of Native peoples, but they realized that they were people like them with different cultures, and they were people they had to depend upon. And I think some of the lessons of their vulnerability as they moved through would be really useful for us to learn in the 21st century.
And they spent a whole winter in the Mandan village in basically North Dakota, I believe it is. And so can we imagine what it was like having this group of the Corps of Discovery living with a village of Indians? Can you give us some idea of what that must have been like?
Yeah, it sounds like from the journals it was relatively chaotic. One of the major tasks that Lewis and Clark faced was keeping the men from fraternizing too much with Native American women in these groups. It was a real site of cultural exchange. I think that was one of the other great things that the journals tell us, is that they moved through dozens of different tribes, and many of those tribes themselves are interacting at a gigantic camp, almost a city, like the Mandan Hidatsa villages. So they really encountered a lot of different cultures. They were exposed to different Native traditions throughout the entire kind of period there. And so the idea that ordinary Americans who'd grown up really frankly in an environment of Indian hating, right, an environment of real kind of fear of the wilderness, in fear of the other, got to spend weeks and weeks at a time in the winter with people, changed people's attitudes in a lot of cases about the nature of difference and how you encounter and deal with the other.
Mm-hmm. And I think that we talked about in a meeting prior to this conversation that there was much more of a sense of democracy, if you want to call it that, along the journey, where if York, who again was William Clark's slave, mm-hmm. he had a voice, he had a vote, and Sacagawea had a voice as well. What about that? Was there a sense of democracy there that was only possible because this was a party that was traveling in the vast unknown and they really needed each person to contribute?
Mm-hmm. I think so. I mean, think of it as a military party that the discipline necessarily has to loosen the further away you get from American civilization, quote unquote. And I think as they move further and further west, people have to step up and take up different roles that might not match their status in the party. So a lowly private might be needed to do something above that kind of rank, or here is the slave, Clark's personal servant, taking on kind of bigger roles than that. The key kind of early example of kind of proto-multicultural democracy happens in the second winter, and they have to decide whether to move their encampment across the Columbia River from the north to the south side of the river. And everyone gets a vote. And I think it's a really interesting thing to kind of contemplate, that here in really what was a kind of elite white man's democracy, here in 1805, right, we're having a discussion in that winter of 1805, 1806, where you're letting a wide range of people participate in decision making. And maybe that's possible because of the nature of the frontier. It loosens things up a little bit. One of the great tragedies, I think, is we don't really know what happens to York, for example, when he comes back. There are some stories that he's freed by Clark. There are some stories that he winds up back in the West, kind of living as an independent person. Clark himself, though, tells a story that at the end of the day, he says York basically couldn't deal with his freedom and wanted to come back and be his slave again, which seems a little self-serving. But the idea that people who were normally in a really subordinate position in society could have independence, autonomy, agency, a real sense of a real role, must have been profoundly transforming for many people of the party, and then also kind of profoundly disappointing when they returned to the United States.
And on that note, we have to go to the break. And when we come back from the break, we'll talk about the wildlife in the Louisiana Territory and why Ken Burns referred to this as Eden in his documentary about Lewis and Clark. Stay with us.
Is law school in your future? A degree in history would be the perfect major for a student going in that direction. Perhaps you like historic preservation, or maybe government work in a federal, state, or local level. they're the largest employers in the nation, and they are looking for people with that kind of degree. The opportunities are endless with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, and my guest today is Dr. Brett Mizelle. Brett, before we went to the break, we were talking about the human interaction that was involved in the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery expedition, but we should talk about the wildlife that existed in the uncharted territory of the Louisiana Purchase. And I'm thinking particularly of the Great Plains. And I mentioned before we went to the break that in Ken Burns' documentary about Lewis and Clark, he referred to this area as Eden because of the abundance of the wildlife. Give us a sense of the scale and the scope of the wildlife presence in this area.
Yeah, hard to imagine by any contemporary standard we would have about how diverse and numerous the plant and animal life would have been on the plains at this period of time. You know, massive herds of bison, you know, tons of various deer and antelope, all kinds of birds. You think at the same time Americans, even back east, are noting the tremendous flocks of pigeons, passenger pigeons, and so forth that dominated kind of the landscape. So yeah, there was a tremendous abundance of wildlife that they saw, and basically one way to think of the Corps of Discovery is basically as a gigantic hunting party. The journals meticulously chart the number of things they killed every day, both for food and kind of for fun as they moved through these areas where there was so much abundant wildlife.
And we saw bison, I guess, as far as the eye could see, and things of that nature. And as we know later on, it became sport or game just to go out and shoot bison just because they could. And we knew that that was the main food source and sustenance source for the Native Americans, and so that encouraged even more of that as the settlers and the military, the American military, decided to drive out the Native Americans. But when we tried to, when I say we, when folks of that era tried to capitalize on buffalo as an attraction at a museum, nobody was interested at that time, because buffalo, as it turned out, were too similar to cattle. And the antelope that you talked about, and there's that famous song about where the deer and the antelope play and so forth in the wide open range. The American antelope didn't really excite the imagination either, because that was too similar to deer and people were very familiar with that. And it actually turned out that what people wanted in terms of going to see exotic animals, they wanted to see the tigers, they wanted to see lions and elephants and things like that. So what about that in terms of what Lewis and Clark were able to discover? Although it was impressive to them, it didn't impress very many people back home, especially things like prairie dogs and magpies and all those other furry little creatures. So in terms of the American experience, why were people so unimpressed with those animals that they found?
Yeah, so much of my earlier work has been about kind of animal exhibitions, and so one of the things I write about a lot is when exotic animals come to America. And so in 1797, the first elephant is brought to America, and it becomes such a phenomenon. People use the phrase "to see the elephant" to mean having had an experience of life, and that phrase lasts all the way through the Civil War. So people are excited by things that are really different. And as you mentioned, a lot of the animals they discover aren't that different, right? They aren't that kind of charismatic. They're not that big. So the prairie dog is of great interest, and they bring back a prairie dog and they bring back a magpie. The prairie dog spends some time, sitting in his cage by the fireplace next to Jefferson. But there really wasn't that many charismatic animals until they discovered the grizzly bear, and that became the animal that started to catch the public's imagination as basically North America's kind of premier predator, large, dangerous, hard to kill, savagely wild, and that becomes an animal that gets the attention. But they noticed it, they wrote about it in the journals, and had many encounters with grizzly bears, very harrowing ones in some ways. But even then, it takes many more years for those specimens to be brought back. Pike brings back some grizzly bears about 10 years later to the East Coast, but it's really not till the 1850s and 1860s when James Capon Grizzly Adams helps kind of popularize the grizzly bear. So we just didn't have the type of wildlife that seemed as exciting as the exotic creatures you could bring in from other parts of the country. There's a way in which Americans weren't that interested in their own natural productions, right, unless they could use those as part of development, right, resources that we could use to develop for wealth accumulation or expansion.
Mm-hmm. And when we think about that abundance of wildlife, there's almost as Ken Burns presented it, there's almost a wistful longing for that today, when we see freeways everywhere and development and things that seem unnatural to us compared to that natural environment. In fact, I was at the farmer's market over the weekend, and there's a fellow there selling pasture-fed, range-free beef and bison and so on, and that poster looks so idyllic. You know, you've got buffalo grazing in the meadow with the hills, and the sun is in just the right position, and so it makes you feel wistful for it. And I'm going to eat that food because it seems more natural. But there was a movement maybe 20, 25 years ago called the Buffalo Commons, which was trying to recreate that sense of common grazing land for buffaloes. Tell us about that. What was that effort about, and is there any chance of it actually taking hold beyond the theoretical stage?
Yeah, what's interesting about the use of the Lewis and Clark journals as a source is that they do in some ways help you get a baseline for what we've lost, right? There really is a very clear declension, right, of a decline of the number and quantity of animals and animal species in America. And the Buffalo Commons Project is proposed in the 1970s by a pair of scientists from the East Coast who suggest basically that given the fact that the Great Plains area is depopulating and that it's not the most useful land for agriculture, it's very water intensive and not very productive, that maybe we should in essence restore that land to what it looked like at the time of Lewis and Clark and replant the shortgrass prairie environment, reintroduce bison where they could be, and kind of restore the habitat, right, for these kinds of animals. It's really interesting. In the 1980s, really, the program was kind of laughed at. There was a lot of backlash against it, a lot of fears that the government might take people's land. But it's really been picked up by private landowners, Ted Turner for being one of them, who's repopulated much of his lands with prairie and bison, and also by Native American groups, which have created a coalition where they work together now to restore prairie landscapes and reintroduce bison. So in some ways, I think it's an idea whose time had not come in the 1970s, but maybe now, as we start thinking about global warming, right? One of the arguments for creating more prairie landscapes on the Great Plains is carbon sequestration. It allows us to do something about kind of global warming, and would also bring tourism to environments where, you know, people don't really visit that much anymore.
Well, let's talk about Lewis and Clark in their own time. And the fact of the matter is, when they returned in 1806, they didn't publish anything when they first came back. And a lot of people, most people didn't even know about this expedition. Jefferson, in fact, had sent out other expeditions as well to make sure, in case Lewis and Clark didn't come back, a lot of people thought they'd probably get killed or they wouldn't make it back anyway. And so they weren't really appreciated at that time. And in fact, some people have said, at best, it was a disappointment, the expedition, and at worst, it was a dismal failure. Why was it considered a failure at that time?
Yeah, I think the interesting reason why it didn't get perceived as a real success at the time was that they had relatively moderate goals, which they achieved, by the way, right? They found a route to the Pacific Ocean. They negotiated with dozens of tribes. They recorded information about the natural and cultural history of that kind of landscape. But people were going west anyway, and I think that's why it didn't make a big difference. When you read the ends of the journals on the return, which are always less exciting, right, than the journals on their way out, right? They're constantly noting people going the other direction, right? As they're coming back to St. Louis, they're noting all these people going the other way. So expansion was happening regardless of what they did. And then there were some other issues why they just didn't really capitalize on it, right? The first person to publish a journal is Patrick Gass, and then Nicholas Biddle kind of edits a version there. Lewis never wrote up kind of the response, wrote up the journals or created a record of the administration. So it kind of just disappeared a little bit from history. So much so that by 1876, by the American centennial, it didn't appear in textbooks very much. I mean, it was maybe mentioned, it got a line or two. So one of the things I love as a historian was, I'm very interested in the idea of historical memory, and they kind of drop off of historical memory pretty much right away, and then only reemerge in the early 20th century. In the early 20th century, we have the centennial of the expedition. There's a big World's Fair in St. Louis. There's a lot of interest in the ideas of the frontier and kind of the loss of wildlife. So really, ever since the beginning of the 20th century, they've kind of become more and more well known, with better and better work done with the journals to kind of really think about the complexity of what they accomplished between 1804 and 1806.
So as you mentioned, at the centennial of the expedition, which was in the early 1900s, of course we had Teddy Roosevelt as our president, and he was the Rough Rider, he was the adventurer, so maybe the adventure story fit well with his administration and what he was doing.
Oh, certainly, and it also fit well when you think about Frederick Jackson Turner's, 1893 kind of really thesis, at the releases on the frontier thesis, right? Where he kind of talks about the frontier is closed. Mm-hmm. So people were very aware, I think, in America that era of the history of U.S. history was over, and so there's kind of a nostalgia in some ways for thinking about that early moment of exploration when the frontier was still the frontier. Now that it's closed, we can look back differently on Lewis and Clark.
We're starting to run low on time in this second segment, so let's talk a little bit about what we know about Meriwether Lewis, that he actually suffered from some mental instability. We think it was probably bipolar syndrome. So there were days at a time when he just wouldn't write anything in the journal. He would become very incommunicative. And then he died, and most people do believe it was a suicide. What do we know about Meriwether Lewis and his mental state and his suicide?
Yeah, Lewis is for me, one of the great tragic figures of American history. Jefferson had known him for a long time and really kind of encouraged his career and his kind of development, but knew he had a melancholy cast of mind. That was a word they used about him a lot. And one of the things that's really interesting when you work with students with the journal is one of the assignments I give them is note when Lewis disappears. He goes for whole sections where he just can't write. And one of the thoughts a lot of scholars have is that his depression has caught up with him. He just can't find the strength, in essence, to put kind of pen to paper. And so there have been all kinds of debates about what happens at Grinder's stand in 1809, but most historians consider, the sad result of it was about suicide. He'd returned from the journey. He had trouble with alcohol both before and after. He'd never found a wife. He's 35 years old. He has a desk job. He's being pursued by creditors. He's got a lot of kind of turmoil in his life, and sadly he takes his own life in 1809 at a relatively young age, a person who had tremendous potential.
We've run out of time. We have about 30 seconds left. I'm going to give you a chance to answer this. This is a big question. Moon landing, astronauts going to the moon, big adventure, the final frontier, and this, the American frontier. Can we equate the two?
I think so, in the sense that it's a really remarkable journey people thought was impossible, right? No one really thought this was kind of possible. I think the really big difference is that there was a different cultural framework around the moon landing where those men were really celebrated. When they returned, they were treated as heroes. They were seen as true kind of pioneers. Whereas, sadly, the Lewis and Clark expedition didn't quite get the credit, at least in their own time, that they probably deserved.
And on that note, we'll have to bring this to a close. I want to thank you for being here today.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Join us again soon for the next episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.